They said no one survived alone out in Clearwater Valley. Not through the winter storms that tore roofs apart, not through the hunger that hollowed out hearts. But somehow, Mary Caldwell had. She was the last soul still living on that stretch of land, a woman who refused to die even after the world forgot her name. Yet on this night, as the wind screamed across the prairie and her last loaf of bread turned to ash in the fire, she didn't know that before dawn a stranger's knock would change everything she thought she knew about fate, kindness, and power. The old cabin creaked with every gust, its walls breathing like an exhausted animal. Rain bled through the ceiling, landing in quiet drops onto the warped wooden floor. Mary sat near the fire, her face lit in soft, dying orange. Her hands were raw from cold, her skin thin and pale. The last of her food, bread so stale it could break a tooth, had fallen into the flames. She watched it blacken, not because she was too weak to save it, but because she had already accepted that hunger would follow her like a shadow. Mary Caldwell had not always lived like this. Years ago, she'd been a wife, a neighbor, someone people waved to in town. She had taught Sunday lessons, baked for church gatherings, and laughed beside her husband Thomas as they planned their future on this very patch of land. But the drought came. The crops withered, the cattle died, and Thomas broke beneath the weight of a world that demanded everything. When he passed, the bankmen came with sharp hats and colder eyes. They took what little was left except the cabin, the one place too worthless for anyone else to want. For 2 years, Mary survived off scraps, charity, and the will of someone who refused to disappear. Each morning she swept her porch even though no one ever came by. Each evening she lit her fire and prayed that somehow kindness would find her again. Tonight, though, the prairie felt different. The wind carried a strange hum, low and uneasy. Coyotes howled in the distance, and every sound beyond her window felt like it had a purpose. When she stepped outside to secure the door latch, she caught sight of something unusual. Hoof prints in the mud, fresh ones, leading toward her cabin, not away. Her stomach tightened. Could be a ranch hand lost in the storm, she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew better. No one from Clearwater came out this far after dark. Not since the disappearances. The thought made her spine prickle. She went back inside, pushing the bolt across the door. The fire had burned low, and the silence inside the cabin grew heavier, pressing against her chest. She wrapped a blanket around herself, rocking slightly in her chair as the rain turned to sleet. Then through the howl of the wind came the sound she dreaded most. A knock. It wasn't timid. It wasn't violent. It was slow, measured, almost deliberate. Mary froze. Her pulse raced as she stared at the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No reply. The second knock came harder, like an answer from the dark. She reached for the old shotgun her husband had left leaning by the hearth. The trigger was rusted, and she hadn't dared test it in years, but it gave her courage to hold it. The firelight flickered as she stepped closer. She could hear breathing now. Someone just outside. "Please," came a man's voice, muffled but calm. "I mean no harm. Just need warmth." Mary hesitated. That voice, there was something about it. Deep, steady, the kind that carried both authority and exhaustion. Not a drifter's slur, not a thief's sneer. Still, she couldn't be sure. "What do you want?" she demanded. "Just a roof till morning." Silence stretched. Mary's heart thudded in her ears. Every instinct told her to keep the door shut. But the memory of Thomas's voice returned, gentle, steady, reminding her of the life she'd once believed in. Never turn away a soul in need, Mary. One day the world might remember your kindness. She lowered the gun. "If you mean no harm, you can come in." The door creaked open and the man stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked through from the storm. Mud streaked his coat, and beneath the brim of his hat his eyes burned like embers that hadn't gone cold. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her with a look that felt both grateful and unreadable. "Much obliged," he said quietly, removing his hat. Mary nodded toward the fire. "Sit by the heat. I've got coffee, if you can call it that. The man chuckled, a low, tired sound. After that ride, I'll take anything. She poured him a cup of weak coffee and watched him sip it slowly. The stranger's hands were rough but well kept, not like a ranch drifter's. His boots were scuffed but expensive. Something about him didn't fit, the posture, the tone, the way he seemed to study the room like it was more than a shelter, like he was searching for something. "You travelin' alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Long way from home." "Where's that?" "South," he said simply, setting the cup down. "Further than I'd care to remember." For a while they sat in silence, the storm raging outside. The fire popped, casting shadows across his face. Under the grime and fatigue, Mary caught glimpses of a man used to control, someone who had lived not just among hardship, but above it. She didn't ask his name, and he didn't offer it. But in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or the quiet meeting of two broken souls. Hours slipped by until the storm began to fade. The stranger leaned back, closing his eyes. The firelight danced over his face, revealing scars that told of battles both physical and private. Mary, too tired to fight her curiosity, studied him closely. There was a gold emblem half hidden beneath his coat, a gleam that didn't belong to a poor man. When she finally drifted to sleep, she thought she heard him whisper something, words lost beneath the wind. But just before dawn, a faint sound broke through the quiet. Not thunder, not the storm. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Mary's eyes flew open, the stranger stirred by the fire. She rose silently, her heart hammering as she peered through the frosted window. Out in the darkness, something moved, a figure, then another. She blinked, trying to focus, and that's when she saw it. The mark of a torch flickering against the horizon, growing closer, followed by the echo of distant hooves. Someone was coming, but not for shelter. The stranger stands suddenly, his face hardening as he stares out the window and mutters, "They've found me." The storm outside wasn't just wind and rain. It was the kind that made animals run for cover and sent men into prayer. Lightning cracked across the prairie like a whip, lighting the valley in violent flashes of white. Inside the fragile cabin, Mary Caldwell sat frozen beside the window, clutching her shotgun. The stranger she had allowed in hours ago hadn't stirred for a long while. He'd fallen asleep beside the fire, and for a fleeting moment she'd almost convinced herself the danger had passed. But then came the second knock. It wasn't from him. It came from outside. Her breath caught. The sound was firm, deliberate, and wrong. Nobody in their right mind would be out there in that storm. She glanced toward the man sleeping near the hearth. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing a sharp jawline, skin weathered by years of sun, and a scar that cut clean across his cheek. Whoever he was, he didn't belong to the kind of world that came begging at strangers' doors. "Someone's here," Mary whispered. Her own voice startled her. The man stirred, his hand instinctively going to the inside of his coat. For a moment, Mary thought she saw metal flash in the light. He stood, slow and deliberate, and met her eyes with a calm that chilled her to the bone. "Don't open it," he said softly, his voice low, steady, and commanding. Too sure, too practiced, not the voice of a man used to asking for help. Mary hesitated. "You know who it is?" He said nothing. The storm thundered again, rattling the windows, shaking the weak door on its hinges. The knock came once more, louder this time. Mary took a step toward the entrance. "If it's someone lost out there," he cut her off sharply. "If it's someone lost, they'd be calling for help, not knocking like they own the place." The tension thickened. Mary's instinct fought between fear and decency. She had been alone too long not to recognize the sound of danger, yet something in her heart still refused to shut the world out completely. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. Only the rain spoke. Mary's hand lingered on the doorknob, her pulse hammering in her ears. She turned to the stranger, whose gaze never left the door. "You sure you don't know them?" she asked. He gave a faint smirk, the kind that hinted at secrets best left buried. Not yet. For a long while neither moved. The wind howled and the fire crackled, filling the silence with a cruel rhythm. Finally the stranger sat back down, his voice quieter now. You shouldn't be living out here alone, too far from town, too easy to be forgotten. Mary studied him warily. You seem to know a lot about danger for a man who claims to be lost. He looked into the fire, his expression unreadable. You learn quick when the world wants to take what's yours. Something in his tone struck her, not fear but authority. His clothes were filthy, his beard unshaven, yet beneath the grime there was a hint of refinement, the kind no drifter carried. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't who he said he was. Lightning flashed again, and for a moment she saw his reflection in the window, eyes sharp, calculating and haunted. To break the tension, she moved toward the cupboard, pulling out what little food she had left. Half a loaf of bread and a small tin of beans. She set them on the table without a word. That's all I've got, she said quietly. He looked at the food, then back at her. You'd give your last meal to a stranger? I wouldn't sleep knowing someone was starving a few feet from my fire, she replied. He gave a slow nod, his expression softening. Most folks wouldn't care, not anymore. Most folks never lost everything they cared for, she said, her voice breaking slightly. For a while they ate in silence. The air between them shifted from suspicion to something quieter, something human. She saw beneath the mud and exhaustion a man carrying a heavy grief of his own. He asked about her husband, about the land, about why she stayed when others left. Each answer drew a little more truth from her until the words felt like confessions to someone who understood too well. And then she asked the question that had been burning at the back of her mind since he arrived. What about you? Where were you headed before this storm found you? He hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. Nowhere that matters. That's not much of an answer. Sometimes the truth ain't worth telling. The way he said it made her throat tighten. His voice carried the kind of weight only regret could give. When the storm began to ease, she rose to pour more coffee. The fire's glow caught something on his wrist, a faint glimmer of gold beneath the cuff of his sleeve. A watch, polished, engraved, not the kind owned by ranch hands or drifters. She turned her gaze away quickly, pretending not to notice. You should rest, she said softly. Storm's near done. He leaned back, closing his eyes. You've got a kind heart, Mrs. Caldwell. Kindness gets a person hurt in this world. She smiled faintly. It's the only thing keeping this world from dying. The stranger said nothing more. He seemed to drift into thought, or maybe memory. The storm faded to a soft drizzle, the sound of raindrops on tin easing into calm. For a fleeting moment it almost felt peaceful again. Then he stood. Mary flinched at the sudden motion. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling something from inside, a coin, old and heavy. Without a word he set it on the table beside the empty plate. The firelight caught its surface, revealing a strange insignia carved deep into the gold, a crest shaped like a horse's head above a star. Mary frowned. I don't need, he interrupted her. Keep it, you might find it useful. Before she could reply, he turned away, tipping his hat in quiet thanks. His boots echoed softly against the wooden floor as he crossed the room. The sound of the door opening filled the cabin. Cold air rushed in, and the stranger stepped out into the fading night. Mary stared at the gold coin glinting on the table, her hands trembling. The crest was familiar, too familiar. It was the same emblem branded onto the wagons of the Hartley estate, a symbol she'd seen years ago when she and her husband delivered supplies to the largest ranch in Clearwater. The same ranch that had belonged to the richest, most powerful man in the valley, a man who had vanished without a trace. Her heart pounded. She turned toward the open door, staring into the distance where the stranger had gone. The storm clouds were lifting, revealing the pale light of dawn, but instead of relief she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Because now she knew the truth. Whoever that man was, He carried the mark of Cole Hartley, the billionaire cowboy who owned everything from these hills to the horizon, and no man like that ever showed up at a poor widow's door by accident. Mary grips the gold coin in her hand as thunder echoes once more outside, and far beyond the valley a horse whinnies in the dark, like a warning that the storm was far from over. The morning after the storm carried a silence so sharp it could have cut glass. Mary Caldwell woke to find the fire had long gone cold and the stranger was nowhere to be seen. The chair where he'd sat was empty, the blanket folded neatly and the cabin door hung half open, rocking slightly with every whisper of the wind. But what caught her eye wasn't the emptiness he left behind. It was the glint on the table, that gold coin, untouched since he'd laid it down. The sunlight slanted through the cracked window, striking the coin just right so that the engraved crest blazed like a brand of fire, a horse's head atop a star ringed by an inscription too worn to read. Mary's breath hitched. That symbol didn't belong to ordinary folk. It was the mark of the Hartley estate, the richest name in all of Clearwater County. The Hartleys had built an empire of cattle, oil, and land so vast it stretched beyond 3 counties. But the family had vanished from public sight years ago after a string of deaths, scandals, and one mysterious disappearance. Mary reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the coin. It was heavier than it looked, thick and real, too real for a man who'd come begging warmth at her door. For a fleeting moment she wondered if the whole night had been a dream. But the mud prints near the door proved otherwise. He'd been there, flesh and blood. And he'd left behind proof that nothing about him was what it seemed. A shiver crept through her spine. What if the coin was stolen? Or worse, what if it was cursed? She thought of the old wives' tales whispered around town, that the Hartley fortune was tainted, built on betrayal and blood. Some said their gold never stayed long with anyone who didn't pay its price. Others said it marked its next owner, a promise and a warning all in one. Mary wrapped the coin in a handkerchief and tucked it inside her coat. She needed answers. By the time she reached Clearwater town, the streets were already stirring with gossip and grit. The air smelled of dust and fresh bread, of a place where folks pretended to mind their own business but never really did. The moment Mary stepped into the general store, every head turned. It had been months since she'd shown her face in town. Mary Caldwell, the shopkeeper said, raising his brow. Ain't seen you since the last harvest fair. What brings you back? Mary hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Just need to ask around. You heard anything about a man traveling through the valley last night? The room grew still for a heartbeat too long. One of the women near the shelves lowered her voice. If you're talking about the drifter that came through on horseback a few days ago, best stay clear of him. Folks say he's trouble. Trouble? Mary asked, her throat dry. Trouble with a capital T, the shopkeeper replied, leaning closer. Old Bill Harper swears he saw him buying supplies with gold, a gold coin, mind you, with that Hartley crest stamped clean across it. Said it gleamed like something straight out of the old ranch vault. Mary's heart nearly stopped. The Hartley Ranch. You mean Cole Hartley? The man chuckled uneasily. Cole Hartley's been gone near 5 years now, ma'am. Rode off after his daddy's death and never came back. Some say he's dead. Others say he's living somewhere out east under a new name. Whatever the truth, that man's as good as a ghost around these parts. Mary felt a weight settle in her stomach. A ghost. That word clung to her like dust. Could it be? Could the stranger in her cabin really have been Cole Hartley, the billionaire cowboy who'd once owned half the land in this county? The thought seemed ridiculous, yet the coin in her pocket burned against her skin like proof. She left the store, her mind tangled with questions. The sun had climbed high now, glinting off rooftops, and the sound of church bells echoed through the hills. As she walked the dirt road back toward her cabin, she replayed every word the stranger had said, every glance, every hesitation. His voice had carried something deliberate, almost regal. His posture hadn't belonged to a beggar. And that scar on his cheek, it looked like the kind a man got defending something worth more than gold. Still, part of her wanted to believe it was just coincidence, that she hadn't accidentally hosted one of the most powerful men in the state. But deep down, something told her the truth wasn't far from that impossible thought. At sundown, Mary sat by the fire again, the coin resting on the table before her. She turned it over and over in her palm. On the backside, she finally noticed faint letters scratched near the edge. CH. The initials confirmed what her mind had tried to deny. Her throat went dry. Cole Hartley. Memories of the Hartley estate flooded back. Stories her husband used to tell about the man who bought up ranches like they were candy, who turned empty land into wealth and hired men who feared him more than they respected him. Cole had been ruthless but fair, they said. Then one day he vanished without warning, leaving his empire to rot. Now somehow he'd turned up at her door. Mary rose, pacing the room. Fear warred with curiosity. If he was alive, why hide? If he was rich, why come to her cabin like a beggar? And most of all, what did he want? She couldn't shake the feeling that his visit hadn't been random. That coin wasn't just a thank you, it was a message. The wind outside shifted again, carrying the sound of distant hooves. She froze, listening. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, fading into the valley. It wasn't thunder this time. It was a rider. Her mind raced. Maybe he'd gone back to the ranch. Maybe he wanted her to follow. Against all logic, against every ounce of fear she had left, Mary wrapped the coin back in cloth, grabbed her shawl, and stepped outside. The night air cut through her bones, but the stars above were clear now, gleaming sharp as silver nails. She followed the dirt path that wound down from her cabin past the old mill and toward the direction of the Hartley lands, the place no one dared to go anymore. The ride there was long, but her determination burned bright. The ranch had once been a palace of the West, thousands of acres, stables lined with champion horses, fences gleaming white under the sun. Now, as she approached, the moon revealed only ruins. The gates hung twisted, the sign half broken. Grass had swallowed the road. The grand house stood in shadow, windows shattered, its silence thick as a secret. Mary stepped through the gates, heart pounding. The coin felt heavy in her pocket, heavier with each step. Then, just as she reached the front steps, a gust of wind carried a whisper through the broken halls, low, almost human. She stopped, cold. A light flickered in the upper window, then another. Mary took a step back, her eyes wide. The Hartley ranch wasn't as empty as the town believed. A figure moved behind the curtain upstairs, a tall shadow that turned toward her as if it had been waiting all along. There are places in the world that seem to breathe even after they've died. The Hartley ranch was one of them. From the moment Mary Caldwell set eyes on it, she knew the stories were wrong. This land wasn't abandoned. It was watching. The wind howled across the plain as she trudged through miles of dust and silence, the gold coin clutched tight in her fist. The air carried a strange heaviness, the kind that pressed on the lungs and whispered warnings too faint to ignore. She had walked half a day to get there, but now, standing before the once grand gates of the richest ranch in Clearwater County, she wondered if she'd made a mistake she couldn't undo. The wrought iron gates stood half-eaten by rust, their hinges bent and their chain broken. The great Hartley crest, the same symbol stamped on the coin in her pocket, still clung to the archway like a ghost refusing to fade. The name itself, Hartley Estate, was etched in metal letters that had lost their shine. The fence stretched for miles, vanishing into dry, rolling hills that used to hum with cattle and labor. Now it was all dust and silence. Mary took a deep breath, pushing the gate open. It gave way with a moan that seemed almost human. The road leading up to the main house was littered with weeds and broken wagon wheels. The smell of decay mixed with something older, money that had gone stale, pride that had rotted in place. Every few steps she felt like the land shifted beneath her feet, as though she was walking into something that didn't want her there. When she finally caught sight of the mansion, her breath faltered. The Hartley house stood like a giant skeleton at the heart of the property. 3 stories tall, its once white walls now the color of dust and smoke. Shutters banged loose against cracked windows, and ivy climbed the stone like veins on dying flesh. But what unsettled her most wasn't the ruin. It was the flicker. In one of the upstairs windows behind shattered glass, a light moved. Mary froze. The sun had already begun to sink behind the ridge, bathing the land in the bruised glow of dusk. For a heartbeat, she thought she imagined it. But there it was again, a faint orange glow shifting from one window to another like someone carrying a lantern inside. Her pulse hammered. If the place was truly abandoned, who was inside? She considered turning back. Her mind screamed at her to do it. But then she felt the weight of the gold coin in her pocket and remembered the stranger's eyes, the calm, commanding ones that seemed to carry a secret too heavy for words. That coin wasn't just payment, it was a link, and she needed to know why. She stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. The sound echoed unnaturally in the stillness. Ahead, the stable doors creaked open slightly, though no wind was strong enough to move them. Mary's throat tightened as she approached, peering inside. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the dim light that filtered through cracks in the roof. Broken saddles, rotted hay, and rusted tools lay strewn about. But there were also fresh footprints in the dirt. Heavy ones. Recent. The smell of leather and smoke lingered faintly, too new to belong to ghosts. A faint snort came from one of the stalls. Mary's heart jumped. She crept closer and stopped dead. A horse, black as coal, stood in the last stall, its mane glossy, its eyes sharp. The beast looked well-fed, strong, alive. Someone was caring for it. Before she could move, a low voice came from the shadows near the stable wall. "You lost, ma'am?" Mary spun, startled. A man stepped out from behind a pillar, his face rough with stubble and his eyes suspicious. He wore an old ranch hand's coat, though his hands were clean and his boots too new for a man who worked in mud. She stammered, clutching her coat tighter. "I came to return something. To Mr. Hartley." The man's expression hardened. "Mr. Hartley?" He let out a sharp laugh. "Ain't no Hartley here, lady. Not for years." "I found something of his," she insisted. "A coin. It has his crest." He stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. "Where'd you get that?" Her grip tightened around the coin in her pocket. "From a traveler." He said nothing, just left it behind. The man's tone shifted, the humor draining from his face. "What traveler?" He didn't give a name. He studied her for a long moment, the lines on his face deepening. "Best you turn around, miss. Folks who go poking around this ranch don't come back with much to tell." Something in his voice told her he wasn't warning out of kindness. It was fear. Real, bone-deep fear. But before she could reply, a door slammed somewhere inside the mansion. Both their heads turned toward the sound. It was faint but deliberate. Metal meeting wood, followed by the creak of footsteps echoing through the hall. The ranch hand's expression drained of color. "Get back to town," he muttered, already backing away. "Ain't nothing here you want to find." Mary's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Then who's inside?" He didn't answer. He only tipped his hat low, turned, and disappeared into the fog rolling off the hills. Within seconds, he was gone. Mary stood alone again, staring at the mansion. The orange light flickered once more in the upper window, brighter this time, almost deliberate, as if whoever was inside knew she was watching. Her pulse drummed in her ears. Her instincts screamed to run, but she forced herself forward one step at a time until she reached the porch. The wooden boards groaned under her weight. She could smell smoke, fresh smoke, from a fire burning somewhere deep within the house. She knocked once. The sound echoed hollow through the vast silence. No answer. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Finally, she pushed the door open. The darkness inside swallowed her whole. Dust swirled in the faint light from outside, and every shadow looked alive. The grand foyer stretched before her with a staircase that wound upward like the ribs of a beast. Portraits lined the walls. Oil paintings of stern men in fine suits and women in pearls. The faces seemed to follow her as she moved. Mary's steps echoed across the marble floor. The silence was unbearable, pressing into her ears. Then from the far end of the hall came a sound that froze her blood. The slow, measured rhythm of boots on wood. She turned toward it, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment there was nothing, only the whisper of wind through the broken windows. Then came the voice. Deep, calm, familiar. "I was wondering when you'd come." Mary spun toward the staircase. At the top stood the stranger from her cabin, no longer ragged or weary, but tall. Composed, his coat clean and his eyes steady as steel. Her breath caught in her chest. The man she'd fed by firelight now looked like he owned the fire itself. The stranger descends the staircase slowly, the gold emblem on his belt glinting in the candlelight as he says, "You've walked a long way, Mrs. Caldwell. Now it's time you learn why." For a moment, Mary Caldwell could not breathe. The figure standing at the top of the grand staircase looked like a ghost resurrected by the dust and silence of the mansion. Yet this was no specter. It was the same man she had fed during the storm. Only now his rough coat and mud-stained boots were gone. In their place was a dark, tailored jacket, a clean white shirt, and a silver belt buckle engraved with that same blazing crest, the mark of the Hartleys. The dying sunlight slanted through a shattered window and caught on his eyes, revealing the truth she had been too afraid to believe. The stranger was Cole Hartley. The name hit her like a bullet. Every story, every rumor she'd ever heard about the billionaire cowboy came flooding back at once. The man who'd owned everything worth owning in Clearwater, who'd built an empire of cattle, oil, and land, and who had vanished one night after his father's death without a word to anyone. He was supposed to be gone, maybe even dead, and yet here he stood, alive, watching her like he'd been waiting all along. "Mr. Hartley," she whispered, her voice barely holding. His expression didn't change. "You took quite the walk to get here, Mrs. Caldwell." Mary swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "You left something behind." She reached into her coat and held out the coin, the one she had carried all this way. The gold gleamed faintly in her trembling hand. Cole descended the staircase slowly, every step echoing through the hollow house. When he reached her, he didn't take the coin. Instead, he looked her over. The dirt on her skirt, the cracked skin on her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, as though trying to read her soul. "You came all this way just to return that?" he asked quietly. "I don't take what isn't mine," she said. "I figured a man ought to have what belongs to him." A faint smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You could have sold it. That coin's worth more than your cabin, maybe your whole town. I wasn't raised that way." He studied her, silent for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I suppose you weren't." The air between them thickened. The smell of old wood and dust hung heavy. And the only sound was the faint crackle of a fire somewhere deep in the house. Mary could feel his gaze like a weight. He was trying to understand her, and she, him. There was power in his stillness, something commanding, but beneath it she saw something else, weariness, a kind of loneliness that mirrored her own. "You shouldn't have come here," he said finally. "Why?" "Because this place isn't safe anymore, not for me, and now, not for you." Her pulse quickened. "You talk like there's something here to be afraid of." "There is," he said simply. Mary frowned. "Then why are you here?" His jaw tightened, but his voice softened. "Because everything I built, everything my family left me, turned to rot the day I walked away. Someone had to stay behind and make sure it didn't burn to the ground completely." Mary stepped closer, her voice low. "And what are you protecting, Mr. Hartley? The land, the ghosts, or the truth?" That made him look up sharply. The firelight from the hall caught in his eyes, turning them into molten steel. "Careful, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Truth is a dangerous thing to dig for around here." Her fear began to fade, replaced by curiosity. And something else. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake. "You talk like a man hiding from something. Or someone." He let out a quiet breath, his mouth curving into a grim smile. Maybe I am. They stood there for a long moment, the distance between them shrinking with each heartbeat. Mary could see the man beneath the myth now. Not the ruthless billionaire from the town's whispers, but a man carrying the burden of a legacy too heavy to bear. There was pride in him, yes, but also regret. Finally, he broke the silence. Do you know what happens to people who come looking for me? I imagine they get the answers they came for, she replied. He gave a quiet laugh, low, tired but sincere. You've got spirit. Most folks lost that years ago. Most folks never had to survive the way I did, she said. Something flickered in his expression then. Respect, maybe even admiration. You remind me of someone, he murmured. Your wife? I was never foolish enough to marry, he said. Not when everything I touch turns to ash. Mary held his gaze. Maybe that's because you've been holding everything too tight. For a brief moment, the air between them shifted, the tension changing into something quieter, almost tender. Cole's eyes softened and his voice dropped low. You fed me when no one else would, he said. You didn't ask who I was, you didn't ask what I'd done. You just opened your door. Do you know how rare that is in this world? I didn't do it expecting thanks, she said. Good, he replied, because you're not getting one. Mary's brow furrowed. Then what am I getting? He stepped closer. She could feel the heat from the nearby fire and the faint scent of rain still clinging to his coat. You're getting involved, he said. And once you're involved with me, Mrs. Caldwell, there's no walking away. Her breath caught, but she didn't step back. You don't scare me. You should. He turned away then, pacing toward a large window overlooking the empty fields. The moonlight cut across his profile, revealing the years etched into his face. A man hardened by choices but not completely hollowed out by them. When you left that coin behind, Mary said softly, was it because you wanted me to find you? Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out across the land that once bore his name. I wanted to see if there was still one decent person left in Clearwater, he said. Turns out there's at least one. Why me? She asked. Because you reminded me of what I used to believe in, he said, his voice quieter now. Before all this turned me into something I swore I'd never be. The vulnerability in his tone caught her off guard. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared, replaced by that same calm control. He turned back to her, and this time his expression was unreadable. You shouldn't have come here, he repeated. Maybe not, she said, lifting her chin. But I'm here now, and you still owe me an explanation. Cole's eyes locked on hers, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. No, Mrs. Caldwell, he said softly. I owe you something far greater. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand, silencing her. You fed me when no one else would, he said. Now I owe you more than you can imagine. The air in the room seemed to thicken around them, the flicker of the fire throwing their shadows long across the floor. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. A storm brewing not outside but within the walls of the Hartley estate. Cole turns toward the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the hills, his expression darkening. They've found me, he mutters as the windows rattle with the echo of riders drawing near. The storm had passed, but the air inside the Hartley mansion felt charged, alive with a tension neither Mary nor Cole could name. The silence stretched thick between them, filled with unspoken questions. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the plains, a distant reminder that calm was only temporary. And then, breaking the quiet, came the most unexpected thing Mary had ever heard. You should stay, Cole said, his tone calm but deliberate. Mary blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. Stay? He nodded once, leaning against the grand staircase, arms folded. The storm's torn up the roads. You won't make it back to town before dark. There's food here, a warm fire. You'll be safer inside these walls. She almost laughed, a dry, nervous sound that didn't reach her eyes. Safe? In your house? The man half the town swears is a ghost? Cole's lips curved slightly. Ghosts don't offer rooms, Mrs. Caldwell. The invitation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp and harder to refuse. For a poor widow who had eaten her last piece of bread only days ago, refusing warmth and safety was foolish. And yet, she couldn't stop the unease coiling in her gut. Men like Cole Hartley didn't give without purpose. Still, she saw no better choice. Just for the night, she said carefully. Tomorrow I'll go. Cole gave a slow nod. Tomorrow, then. He gestured toward the east wing of the house, what had once been the servants' quarters. Mary followed, her footsteps echoing across marble floors still littered with dust. Every wall held the ghost of wealth, cracked portraits, faded curtains, furniture once meant for a dynasty. She couldn't help but wonder why a man so powerful lived surrounded by the ruins of his own name. The room he led her to was simple but intact. A small bed, a dresser, and a lamp whose flame flickered against the peeling wallpaper. As he left her there, he paused at the door. "Lock it if it makes you feel better," he said. "I wasn't planning to," she replied softly. He gave her a look, part curiosity, part respect, and then disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. Hours passed before Mary could bring herself to sleep. The house seemed to breathe around her, floorboards creaking, old pipes sighing like restless ghosts. Somewhere down the corridor she heard the low murmur of Cole's voice, deep and steady, speaking to no one she could see. By morning the smell of coffee and smoke drifted through the air. When she stepped into the kitchen she found him there, sleeves rolled, frying eggs over a cast-iron stove. It was such a human image, the richest man she'd ever known, cooking breakfast in silence, that it nearly made her laugh. "You cook?" she asked, half teasing. He glanced up, a hint of humor in his eyes. "I do what I have to. The staff left a long time ago. You could have hired more." "I could," he said, "but I don't much care. For company." They ate together at the long dining table, the morning light falling across the cracked china and faded silver. Mary noticed the way he moved, measured, careful, as though every gesture was calculated to hide something deeper. "Why did you disappear, Mr. Hartley?" she finally asked. Cole's knife froze mid-cut. For a moment the only sound was the clock ticking on the wall. Then he leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed somewhere far away. "Because everything I touched turned against me," he said. "My family, my land, even the men who worked for me. When my father died, I inherited everything. The wealth, the power, the enemies. I thought I could buy loyalty. Turns out money just buys silence. And silence doesn't last." Mary's gaze softened. "You mean someone betrayed you?" He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Several someones. One of them was my own blood." The words hung heavy in the air. Mary felt the sting of recognition. Betrayal was something she knew all too well. "So you walked away?" she said quietly. "I didn't walk," he murmured. "I burned it all down and disappeared." She looked at him differently then, not as a figure of wealth, but as a man consumed by it. The lines on his face weren't carved by time, but by guilt. "Maybe that's why you came to my door," she said softly. "You were looking for something money couldn't buy." For the first time his eyes met hers without the armor of pride. "Maybe I was." The conversation ended there, but the quiet that followed was no longer tense. It was warm, fragile. Over the next few days, Mary stayed longer than she meant to. Each morning she told herself she'd leave, but every night the wind changed and her heart convinced her otherwise. She repaired what she could in the house, swept the floors, dusted the halls, opened curtains long sealed to light. And slowly the mansion began to breathe again. Cole watched her from a distance, saying little, but his eyes followed her movements with quiet fascination. He had spent years surrounded by wealth, yet untouched by warmth. And now, in this widow who carried nothing but decency, he found something his fortune had never given him: peace. Still, neither spoke of it. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills, Mary found him on the porch, staring at the horizon. "You're not as hard as you want people to think," she said gently. Cole didn't look at her. "You're not as fragile as people think either." Their words lingered between them, heavy with things neither dared admit. The air hummed with the unspoken, not romance, not yet, but the beginning of something close enough to fear. Then, just as the quiet began to settle, a sharp clatter broke the stillness. A horse galloped into the courtyard, hooves striking hard against stone. Cole stood abruptly, his expression darkening. A rider dismounted. A man in a long black coat, face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Mail for you, Mr. Hartley," the rider said, handing him a sealed envelope. Cole took it without a word. The rider tipped his hat to Mary, then turned and rode off without looking back. She watched as Cole broke the seal, his eyes scanning the page, his jaw clenched and the color drained from his face. "What is it?" Mary asked, her stomach tightening. He didn't answer at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Someone I thought was dead," he said, "isn't." Mary frowned. "Who?" He looked up, his expression unreadable, equal parts anger and dread. "The man who destroyed my family, the one I burned everything to escape." The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he folded it, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the ranch. "He's coming back," Cole said, his tone cold and final. "And he's coming for me." The wind howls across the open plains as Cole crushes the letter in his hand, while far off in the valley the faint echo of a gunshot signals that the past he buried is already riding closer. The day the past returned to Clearwater, the wind carried the smell of gun oil and vengeance. By afternoon, dust clouds were rising from the east road, not from cattle, but from a single rider cutting through the valley like a dark omen. The town's quiet broke with whispers that spread faster than wildfire. "He's back, the man who used to ride with Hartley." Cole Hartley stood on the front porch of his ranch, his jaw tight as the rider came into view. Even before the man dismounted, Cole knew who it was. Some faces never fade, especially the ones that ruin you. The rider swung down from his horse, tall and broad, dressed in a black duster that caught the dying light like a shroud. His name was Silas Crow, once Cole's closest friend, business partner, and brother in ambition. Together they had built the empire that made the Hartley name worth more than gold, and together they had watched it crumble. Silas had been the knife in Cole's back, the man who sold him out to competitors and left his name to rot. And now, after years in the shadows, he'd come home. "Well, if it ain't the ghost himself," Silas said with a half-smile as he approached. "I thought you'd buried yourself in this place for good." Cole's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You were supposed to be dead." Silas shrugged. "Ain't that what makes a good story? The dead always come back when the living forget their debts." Mary watched from the window of the old house, her heart pounding. She had seen anger before, the kind that men carried when money was short or pride was bruised. But nothing like this. This wasn't anger. It was history breathing in front of her eyes. The two men faced each other like guns primed for the draw. "You've got something that used to be mine," Silas said, stepping closer. "This land, that name, that fortune. It all started with both of us, Cole, and I aim to finish what you ran from." Cole didn't move. "You sold your share the day you sold your soul." Silas laughed, a cold, dry sound that made Mary's stomach twist. "Don't preach to me about souls. I learned from the best." The tension cracked like thunder. Cole's hands were steady, but his eyes burned with something darker than fury. The kind of hatred that only comes from betrayal that never healed. Mary wanted to step outside, to stop whatever was about to happen, but her instincts screamed to stay put. Silas leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You can keep pretending you're some kind of fallen saint, Hartley, but everyone knows you didn't disappear out of guilt. You ran because you were scared. Scared of me. Scared of the truth." "And what truth is that?" Cole asked. "That everything you built was mine first. The words hung like gun smoke in the air. Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he turned his back, heading for the porch steps. You had your chance, Silas. You traded loyalty for greed. You don't get to come back and rewrite the past. Silas's voice hardened. The past ain't done with you, Cole, and neither am I. The sound of spurs against gravel followed as Silas mounted his horse again. He looked toward the window, his gaze briefly landing on Mary. His smile curved, slow and cruel. Then he rode off toward town, dust trailing behind him like a storm brewing on the horizon. That night the ranch was silent, but Mary couldn't shake the tension that clung to the air. Cole sat alone in the study, the letter from earlier still on the desk beside a half-empty glass. His face was a mask of control, but she could see the weight pressing down on him. He was your partner, she said softly. Cole didn't look up. He was my mistake. What does he want? What every man who's lost everything wants, he said. Someone else to blame. Mary stepped closer. And what will you do? His eyes finally lifted to hers, steady and cold. What I should have done years ago, finish it. She stared at him, a chill running through her chest. If you do that, you'll lose yourself again. Cole said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. The fire beside him hissed as a log cracked and fell apart, the sound sharp and final. Later that evening she heard horses again, several this time, heading toward the old Hartley stables. Mary slipped from her room, moving through the dark hallway until she reached the front window. Down below she saw Silas and 3 riders with him, lanterns swinging in the night. They spoke to one of Cole's ranch hands, the exchange hushed but heated. Mary stepped closer, straining to hear, and caught fragments of their words. Doesn't deserve that land. Ain't the man he used to be. We can take it back, easy. The ranch hand pointed toward the mansion, and Silas's gaze followed, his eyes lifted toward her window. And in that instant, Mary realized he could see her silhouette framed in the lamplight. Her breath caught. Silas's smirk returned. Cold, knowing, dangerous. He tipped his hat as if to acknowledge her. Then he said something to his men, and they mounted up again, riding into the night. Mary pulled away from the window, her heart pounding. She turned to find Cole standing behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was calm. He saw you. She nodded. He knows I'm here. Cole exhaled slowly. Then he'll use that. What do you mean? He looked past her, out the window where the lantern lights of the riders faded into the distance. Silas Crow doesn't fight fair. He never did. If he can't hurt me through my name, he'll hurt me through the one person in this house I actually care about. Mary felt the words like a weight on her chest. I can leave. No, he said quickly, almost too sharply. That's what he wants. He'll follow you. And I don't run from men like him anymore. The silence that followed was heavy and intimate, filled with everything neither dared say. She saw then that beneath all his power and pride, Cole was still a man haunted, not by what he'd lost, but by what he was afraid to lose again. When dawn came, the ranch awoke to unease. The workers avoided eye contact, whispers cutting through the air like dry grass. News had already spread. Silas Crow had been seen in town, drinking, laughing, and talking about reclaiming what was rightfully his. Mary went to the barn, hoping for a moment of quiet, but as she stepped inside, she froze. Someone had been there. The horses were restless, their stalls disturbed, and on the floor lay something that didn't belong. A single playing card face up in the dirt. The ace of spades. Her pulse quickened. She turned it over to find a message scrawled in pencil. Every ghost leaves a trail. See you soon, Mrs. Caldwell. Mary drops the card, her hands trembling as Cole storms into the barn holding a telegram in his fist, his face pale as ash. He's already made his move, he says, voice low, and he's coming for you first. The morning after Silas's threat, the Hartley ranch no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap waiting to spring. Mary woke to the uneasy silence of men whispering outside. the kind of hush that comes before something cruel. The sun was barely up when she saw Cole ride out toward town, his jaw set and shoulders tight. He didn't tell her where he was going, but she knew. He was meeting the man who'd come to destroy him. She tried to stay busy, sweeping the porch, tending the horses, keeping her thoughts from turning dark. But even as she worked, she felt eyes on her. The ranch hands who had once nodded, politely now watched her with suspicion, their glances cutting like knives. Something had shifted overnight. By noon, her unease became prophecy. A rider appeared at the gate, not Cole, but Silas Crow himself. He dismounted with practiced ease, brushing the dust from his coat, that same cruel smirk carved into his face. The man carried power in his silence, the kind that made good people flinch. Mary's breath caught as he approached, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Mrs. Caldwell," he greeted, tipping his hat in mock politeness. "Hope I ain't intruding." "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady, though her stomach twisted. "Just a conversation," he said easily. "You and me, we share something in common. We've both been on the wrong side of Cole Hartley's pride." Mary crossed her arms. "You don't know anything about me?" "Oh, I know plenty," he said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Widowed. Poor. Kind enough to feed a stranger when you've got nothing yourself. That's good character. Dangerous kind of good, if you ask me. A man like Hartley doesn't deserve that kind of loyalty." She held his gaze unmoving. "If you came to insult him, you can turn around." Silas chuckled. "I came to offer you something better. Freedom, comfort, maybe even a little revenge." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. When he opened it, the sight nearly made Mary step back. It was a banknote, stamped and signed, promising enough money to buy her old land back 10 times over. "You take this," Silas said softly, "and you walk away. That's all. You don't have to do anything you'll regret. Just tell me what he's hiding, where he keeps his ledgers, who he talks to, where he rides when he leaves at night. That's all I'm asking." Mary stared at the money, the promise of everything she'd ever needed. It shimmered like salvation, like a second chance at life. Her hands trembled, and for a moment she could almost see herself taking it. The cold cabin, the hunger, the loneliness. It would all end here. But then she remembered Cole's eyes that night in the firelight, the quiet way he'd said, "You fed me when no one else would." He wasn't a good man by the world's standards, but he'd given her something far rarer than charity: respect. She took a step back, her voice steady now. "I don't betray people who've shown me kindness." Silas's smirk faltered. "That's a shame," he said, his tone darkening. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than that." "I've made my choice." He nodded slowly. "So be it." Without another word, he tucked the note away, mounted his horse, and rode off. But the look he gave her before he left told her one thing clear as day. This wasn't over. By dusk, the ranch had turned cold toward her. The men who once nodded good morning now wouldn't meet her eyes. Whispered words followed her wherever she went. Thief, liar, drifter. When she entered the stables, conversation stopped. When she walked into the kitchen, people left. Something was wrong. She found out just how wrong when Cole returned that evening, his face hard as stone. He stormed through the front door, a small leather pouch clutched in his hand. He threw it down on the table, and silver coins spilled across the wood. "Care to explain why my money was found under your bed?" he demanded. Mary froze. "What?" "The ranch hands found it this morning, thought I should know." Her pulse raced. "That's not mine. You know it's not." "Then who put it there?" he snapped. "I don't know, but you do. That man, Silas, he—" Cole cut her off. "Silas hasn't set foot on this land in years." She stepped closer, desperate. "He was here, Cole, today. He offered me money to betray you. I turned him down." For a long, terrible moment, Cole just stared at her. And in that silence, she saw it. Doubt. The same doubt she'd seen in everyone else. "Cole, please," she whispered. You have to believe me." He turned away, his voice quieter but sharper than before. "You should leave." The words hit harder than any blow. She stood there trembling. "After everything I've done for you?" "This isn't about gratitude," he said without looking back. "It's about trust. And I can't afford to be wrong again." Her throat tightened. "Then you already are." She turned, walked to the door, and didn't look back. By the time she reached town, the whispers had already spread. The people who once pitied her now mocked her. Mary Caldwell, the woman who stole from the man who fed her. She tried to shout the truth, but truth was cheap currency in Clearwater. Lies traveled faster. That night she found herself outside her old cabin again, the wind howling through the broken boards, the fire long dead. She sat there on the cold floor, clutching the handkerchief that once held the gold coin, and wept until her voice gave out. Back at the ranch, Cole sat alone by the fire, the pouch of coins beside him. He poured himself a drink, but his hand shook as he lifted it. Something in him refused to rest easy. He opened the pouch again, and that's when he saw it. A mark burned into the leather. A small spade carved with a knife's edge. Silas Crow's calling card. Cole's eyes went wide. He stood abruptly, the realization cutting through him like lightning. "Mary," he whispered. He ran for the door, his boots pounding against the floor. But by the time he reached the road, the night had swallowed everything. The wind howled across the plains, and her trail was already fading into the desert. Cole mounts his horse and rides into the darkness, shouting her name into the cold wind. Unaware that far ahead Mary's lantern flickers once, then goes out, leaving her silhouette lost against the endless horizon. The storm came without warning, a monstrous wall of black that swallowed the sky and tore the horizon in half. By nightfall, the valley was unrecognizable. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the land, uprooting fences, snapping trees. Lightning flashed across the plains, turning every shadow into a ghost. And somewhere out there, Mary Caldwell was fighting to stay alive. Rain stung her face like shards of glass as she stumbled down the dirt road, her shawl clinging to her shoulders, soaked through and heavy as guilt. Each step grew harder, her boots sinking into the mud. The lantern she carried flickered, then died completely, leaving her alone in the vast dark. Somewhere behind her, the echoes of Cole's betrayal still chased her. Words she'd tried not to believe but couldn't forget. "You should leave." The phrase repeated in her mind like a curse, and every gust of wind seemed to whisper it back to her. The storm wasn't just weather. It was judgment. The sky itself seemed to rage against her, reflecting the chaos that had swallowed her heart. She had lost everything before, her husband, her home, her dignity. But losing trust this time hurt deeper. Kindness had been her only wealth, and now even that had been twisted against her. A flash of lightning split the night, revealing the endless emptiness around her. The barren plains stretching into shadow, the distant hills now drowned in rain. Her body trembled with cold, but she pushed forward, whispering to herself to keep moving. Just reach the river. Just reach the bridge. But the road blurred beneath her, and her strength began to slip away. Miles behind her, Cole Hartley rode into the storm like a man possessed. The thunder drowned out his thoughts, but guilt was louder than any wind. He had been too blind, too proud to see the truth. And now, if he didn't find her soon, the storm would finish what his doubt had started. Rain lashed his face, the horse beneath him straining against the gale. Lightning tore open the sky, and for a brief second he saw the valley ahead, nothing but mud and fury. He leaned forward, urging the stallion faster. "Come on, girl," he muttered, voice raw. "She's out there somewhere." Each time the thunder cracked, memories flashed behind his eyes. Mary's voice, soft and steady in that lonely cabin. Her smile when she refused Silas's offer. The way she'd stood before him unflinching even as he cast her out. "You should have trusted her," the voice in his mind growled. "You should have believed her." He gritted his teeth, spurring the horse harder. "Not this time," he swore. The rain thickened until it felt like the sky itself was collapsing. Water poured down in sheets, soaking him through, blinding his path. But he didn't slow. He followed the faint trail of footprints already half swallowed by mud. She had been heading west, toward the old crossing. A dangerous route even in good weather. Cole's chest burned with every breath, but he couldn't stop. Guilt drove him harder than fear. He remembered the night she'd found him, a stranger at her door, half dead from the cold. She'd fed him without knowing who he was, without asking why he'd come. He'd seen strength in her that day, the kind that didn't come from wealth or power, but from decency. He'd ruined that. Lightning struck again, illuminating the plains for a heartbeat. And there she was. Mary collapsed in the mud, her shawl torn and tangled, her hair plastered to her face. She wasn't moving. Cole's heart lurched. "Mary!" he shouted, leaping from his horse. He ran to her, slipping, falling to his knees beside her. Her skin was ice cold beneath his hands. Mud streaked her cheeks and her lips were pale, almost blue. He shook her gently, desperate. "Mary, look at me. Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open just barely. For a moment they looked at him not with fear, but with something worse. Disappointment. He cupped her face, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was wrong about everything." Her lips moved, but no sound came at first. Then, as thunder rumbled above, she whispered weakly, "Why? Did you doubt me?" The words hit harder than any blow. Cole pressed her closer, his jaw trembling. "Don't do this, please, not like this." The storm raged around them, but all he could hear was the faint, uneven sound of her breathing. He tore off his coat, wrapping it around her, trying to block the wind. His horse shifted restlessly nearby, its nostrils flaring, thunder spooking it. "Hold on," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I'll get you out of this, I swear it." But her eyes were already slipping closed again. Cole lifted her into his arms, her body light and fragile as glass. He stumbled toward the horse, each step sinking into mud. The wind whipped through the valley like a scream. When he finally managed to hoist her up, he climbed into the saddle, cradling her against him. He kicked the horse forward, and they rode through hell itself, rain slashing their faces, lightning painting the world in violent flashes. The storm clawed at them, but Cole didn't stop. He kept whispering her name over and over, as though it alone could keep her tethered to life. "Stay with me, Mary, just stay with me." Each mile felt endless. He could barely see the path, but he knew where he was heading. The old outpost by the ridge where the Hartley Ranch's doctor once lived. It was miles away, maybe too far, but it was their only chance. Mary stirred once, her voice faint. "You believed him." Cole's throat tightened. "I was a fool," he said. "I see that now." She gave the smallest of smiles, barely there. "You always were." Then she went limp again. "Mary!" he shouted, shaking her gently. But she didn't answer. Lightning flashed again, revealing the outpost's roof through the haze of rain. A single light flickering inside. Relief hit him like a surge of fire. He urged the horse forward, bursting through the storm until they reached the porch. He dismounted in one motion, carrying her through the door. The doctor's apprentice, startled from sleep, sprang up as Cole shouted for help. They laid her on the table near the fire, stripping off the wet shawl, covering her in blankets. Cole's hands trembled as he brushed her hair from her face. She was so still it terrified him. The doctor pressed his fingers against her neck, feeling for life. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then he looked up. "She's alive," he said, "but barely." Cole exhaled, his body collapsing into the nearest chair. His entire frame shook with a mixture of rain, exhaustion, and regret. He stared at her, at the woman who'd done nothing but show him decency, and whispered, "You should have never met me." Outside, the storm began to fade, its fury slowly dying in the distance. But inside, the air remained heavy, because the real storm had just begun. Mary's body jolts once as her breathing weakens again. Cole leans forward in panic, and then, in a voice barely audible over the crackling fire, she whispers one last time, "Why did you doubt me?" before falling completely still. The first light of dawn fell cold and gray across the valley, but to Cole Hartley, it felt like the world had gone black. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wasteland of broken fences, flooded fields, and a silence heavy enough to crush a man's soul. Inside the outpost, the fire had long burned out, its ashes whispering the only truth he couldn't face. Mary Caldwell was gone. He stood beside the table where she had lain, her shawl still draped across the chair, her faint scent lingering in the air. The doctor had done everything he could, but when dawn came, she had slipped into stillness. Cole hadn't spoken a word since. He just stared at her hand, the same hand that had once offered him bread and kindness when he had nothing but shame. "You should have never met me," he whispered, his voice hollow. Then he picked up his hat, placed it over his heart, and walked out into the rising wind. Something inside him broke that morning, and the last piece of gentleness left in a man who'd already lost too much. When he mounted his horse, there was no hesitation, no mercy in his eyes, only vengeance. By midday, word reached him that Silas Crow had made his move. The traitor had ridden into Clearwater with hired guns, claiming the Hartley Ranch as his own. He told the townsfolk that Cole was dead, that the Hartley fortune had always belonged to him, and with no one left to speak otherwise, the men had believed it. But Cole Hartley wasn't dead. He rode hard through the dust, his coat whipping behind him like a shadow. Every hoofbeat echoed like thunder across the plain. When the Hartley mansion came into view, its windows dark, its fences torn, its men armed, Cole didn't slow. He drew his rifle from the saddle and let out a sound that was half war cry, half grief, and all fury. The first shot split the air before any man could blink. One of Silas's riders fell from his horse, the others scattering for cover. Cole dismounted, moving with the precision of someone who'd spent years building and defending this land. The sound of gunfire thundered across the valley. Inside the house, Silas watched from the balcony, calm and calculating. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "The dead cowboy rides again." He turned to his men. "Bring him to me. Alive or breathing, I don't care which." But Cole was no easy prey. He moved like a storm returned to flesh, every shot clean, every motion driven by rage and regret. Dust and gunpowder filled the air, the smell of iron and vengeance mingling under the hot sun. By the time the smoke cleared, half of Silas's men were down. The rest fled toward town, leaving their boss to face the reckoning alone. Cole stepped through the broken doors of the mansion, his boots echoing against the marble like a funeral march. "End of the line, Silas," he called out, his voice steady, cold. Silas stood at the top of the stairs, revolver in hand, a grin stretching across his face. "You always were too sentimental for this world, Cole. Thought you could fix it with kindness and promises, but in the end, you're just like me." Cole raised his rifle. "No, Silas. I buried the part of me that was like you the day I met her." "Her?" Silas scoffed. "You mean that widow? The one you tossed aside?" Cole's jaw tightened. "Oh, don't look so noble," Silas sneered. "You think you're any better than me? You used her just like you used everyone else. Difference is, I don't lie about what I am." The shot came fast. Cole's bullet ripped through Silas's shoulder, spinning him backward into the railing. "You talk too much," Cole said, voice cold as the steel in his hands. Silas clutched his wound, breathing hard, his grin fading into fury. "You think this makes you clean? You think killing me will bring her back?" Cole stepped closer. "No, but it'll make sure no one else like you ever touches what she died for." The two men faced each other in the ruins of everything they'd built. Partners once bound by greed, now divided by the only thing neither had ever known how to handle: guilt. Silas lunged, firing wildly. The shot grazed Cole's arm, drawing blood, but the second that followed ended it. Silas fell to his knees, eyes wide, disbelief frozen on his face. The revolver slipped from his hand. Cole stood over him, chest heaving. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Silas coughed, blood on his lips. "You'll never outrun it, Hartley," he rasped. "You can't buy forgiveness." Cole stared down at him. "I'm done buying anything." Silas fell back, his last breath carried away by the wind. Outside, the surviving ranch hands began to return. Men who had once worked for Cole, then for Silas, now unsure who truly owned their loyalty. Cole stepped out onto the porch, blood dripping from his sleeve, his expression unreadable. "Anyone who wants to stay," he said quietly, "stays as a free man. Anyone who wants to go, take your horse and ride." No one moved, not one soul. They had seen enough to understand that Cole Hartley wasn't a man anymore. He was something forged out of loss, a reckoning given form. When the sun began to set, the house was quiet again. The battle was over, but the victory felt hollow. Cole walked through the empty halls, his boots echoing off the stone. Every shadow seemed to whisper her name. Mary. He stopped in the study, staring at the fire that burned low in the hearth. Her shawl still hung on the back of a chair, where she'd left it the last night they'd spoken. He picked it up slowly, running his hand over the worn fabric. "You were right," he said softly. "I doubted the only person who ever saw me for more than what I owned." His voice cracked for the first time. "I don't deserve forgiveness." A knock at the door broke the silence. Cole turned, frowning. One of the stable boys stood there, soaked in sweat and dust. "Sir," the boy panted, "a message from the doctor in Clearwater." Cole's heart stilled. "What about the doctor?" The boy handed him a folded note. "He said it's about the woman you brought in." Cole snatched the note, tearing it open. His eyes scanned the words once, twice, and then his hands began to shake. The doctor's message was short, written in haste. "She's alive, weak, but breathing. Said she doesn't want you to come." Cole stood there for a long moment, the words burning in his mind. Then, without another word, he folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing not relief, but something darker, a mix of hope and punishment he wasn't sure how to bear. He turned toward the open door, staring out into the twilight as the wind carried the scent of rain. "You can run from a man's lies," he murmured, "but never from his truth." Cole mounts his horse and rides toward the doctor's outpost, determination burning in his eyes, unaware that someone else is already watching from the hills, following his every move. The richest man in Clearwater rode through the valley with nothing left to his name but guilt. His once polished boots were caked with mud, his fine coat torn, his hat heavy with rain. The ranch behind him burned faintly in the distance, the empire he'd built, defended and lost. He didn't look back. For the first time in his life, Cole Hartley wasn't chasing fortune or vengeance. He was chasing forgiveness. The road to the healer's cottage was narrow, swallowed by brush and fog. The trail wound through what used to be the outer edges of his land, now reclaimed by silence and time. Each hoofbeat echoed the truth he'd tried to escape, every mile taking him further from wealth and closer to reckoning. When he finally reached the small cabin, the world felt still again. Smoke curled from the chimney and the faint glow of lamplight spilled through the windows. Cole dismounted, boots sinking into the wet ground. His hands trembled as he reached for the door. Inside, Mary Caldwell sat by the fire, pale but alive. Her hands rested in her lap, her hair loose, her eyes distant. She didn't flinch when the door opened. She didn't need to. She already knew who it was. Cole froze at the threshold, hat in hand. For a man who had faced gunfire and betrayal, this moment frightened him more than any. "Mary," he said quietly. She turned her head slightly, her gaze calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. "I had to see you. I had to make it right." "There's nothing left to make right," she replied softly. "You doubted me when all I gave you was truth." Her words cut through him. "I know," he said, "and I'll regret it every day I draw breath." Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. The fire crackled and the smell of herbs lingered in the air. Cole's posture broke, shoulders slumped, head bowed. No trace of the proud rancher remained. "You fed me when you had nothing," he said. "You treated me like a man when I wasn't acting like one. And I repaid you with doubt." Mary's eyes softened, but only slightly. You think an apology fixes that? No, he admitted, but it's all I have left to give. He dropped to one knee before her. The movement was slow, deliberate and final. The man who once owned half the valley, who'd built towns, crushed rivals, and commanded empires, now knelt before a woman who'd had nothing. His voice broke as he spoke again. I built everything I thought mattered, Mary, land, gold, a name people feared. But I never knew peace until I met you. Tears welled in her eyes despite herself. Peace? She whispered. Do you even know what that word means? Cole's gaze rose to meet hers. Maybe not, but I'm learning. Because peace doesn't come from power. It comes from people who remind you who you were before the world made you forget. Mary's resolve faltered. She wanted to stay angry, to keep her distance. But seeing him on his knees, stripped of arrogance, stripped of pride, shook something deep within her. She had every reason to turn him away, and yet she couldn't. You don't owe me anything, she said quietly. Kindness doesn't demand payment. It only asks for truth. Cole nodded slowly, his throat tightening. Then the truth is this. Everything I ever built means nothing without the one person who made me want to deserve it. The silence that followed was unlike any before. It wasn't heavy. It was healing. After a long moment, Mary gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit down, Cole. You look like you've been running from God himself. He managed a faint, grateful smile and sat. For a while, neither spoke. They simply listened to the wind outside, the steady rhythm of rain against the roof. Finally, Mary broke the quiet. What will you do now? Cole stared into the fire. Start over, but not for me. She tilted her head. For who, then? For this town, he said. For the people I let down, for the men I led astray. I've spent half my life taking, and it's time I start giving. Mary watched him carefully. And how do you plan to do that? He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded set of documents, placing them on the table. Deeds, he said. To the land, all of it. Her brows furrowed. You're giving it away? He nodded. The farms go back to the families that worked them. The stables, the tools, the fields. They're theirs now. I kept too much for too long. Mary stared at him, trying to reconcile the man she'd met. The cold, calculating cowboy, with the one sitting before her now. He looked older somehow, but lighter too. You think that'll undo what's been done? She asked. He gave a small shake of his head. No, but maybe it'll stop others from making the same mistakes. The door opened then, and the local preacher stepped in, drenched from the rain. He greeted Mary warmly, then turned to Cole, surprised to see him there. Mr. Hartley, he said carefully, the town heard what you did. Giving up your land, folks didn't believe it at first. It's true, Cole said simply. The preacher smiled faintly. They're gathering in the square tonight. They'd like to see you. And her. Mary's eyes widened slightly. Me? The preacher nodded. They want to thank the woman who softened a hard man's heart. Cole looked at her then, not as a plea but as a question. Mary hesitated. She had dreamed once of being seen again, of belonging somewhere beyond loneliness. But the idea of facing those people, the same ones who had turned their backs on her, made her chest tighten. I don't know if I can, she admitted. Cole stood, adjusting his coat. You don't have to decide now. He reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. A single gold coin, the same one she had returned to him. For luck, he said quietly. She looked down at it, the firelight glinting across its worn surface. The coin had once represented everything wrong with him. Greed, pride, control. Now it was something else entirely. Redemption. When she looked up again, he was already at the door. Cole, she called softly. He turned. Why me? She asked. Why come all this way for me? He gave a faint, almost broken smile. Because when the world turned its back on me, you opened your door. And with that, he stepped into the rain. Mary sat in silence long after he was gone, the fire casting her shadow against the wall. Outside, the storm had eased, and somewhere in the distance the church bells of Clearwater began to ring, calling the town together. She stood slowly, the gold coin warm in her hand, and walked to the window. The road stretched ahead, glistening under the fading light. The town lay beyond the hills, waiting. Her heart ached with uncertainty and something else, hope. Mary grips the coin tightly, staring toward the horizon as the bells toll louder. She whispers to herself, "Maybe it's time the world remembered my name," before stepping out into the dusk. A year had passed since the night the storm broke, and Clearwater was no longer the same town it used to be. The dust that once coated its streets had given way to color. Painted storefronts, full barns, and laughter that carried through the valley like a long-forgotten song. But what changed Clearwater most wasn't the wealth that had returned. It was the story everyone whispered about, a story of a man who vanished and a woman who stayed. The old Hartley land, once silent and cursed, now flourished again. Fields bloomed with life. Horses ran free where fences had fallen. No one knew exactly who owned it anymore. All they knew was that the deeds had been signed over to the townsfolk, the debts forgiven, and the fortunes scattered back to the people who had lost everything. It wasn't a miracle from heaven, though some liked to call it that. It was the final act of the cowboy who disappeared. Cole Hartley, the man who once ruled the valley with an iron will and then left it humbled, healed, and unrecognizable. And at the center of it all was Mary Caldwell, the widow whose kindness had changed the course of the richest man's life. She lived quietly now in a small house by the riverbank on the edge of town. Every morning the smell of bread baking drifted through her windows. The little building beside her home, once a broken-down storage shed, had become Clearwater's heart. Its sign, painted by hand, read, "Mary's Kitchen." Each day the doors opened to feed whoever walked in hungry, ranch hands, widows, drifters, and children with dust on their boots. No one paid a cent. The food came from donations left quietly at her door, from farms Cole had once owned and given away. The town called it charity. Mary called it duty. People came from miles away to see the woman the papers had written about, the one who tamed the billionaire cowboy's heart without ever marrying him. Reporters tried to get her story, but she never said much. When asked how she'd turned a man like Cole Hartley into a legend, she only smiled and said, "I just fed a hungry stranger." But every evening when the sun dipped behind the hills and the last visitor left, Mary would sit by the window and read the same letter over and over. It was the last thing Cole had left her before he vanished again. The handwriting was rough, uneven, written by a man more used to contracts and ledgers than words from the heart. "Mary, if you're reading this, it means I kept my promise. The land belongs to them now. You taught me that a man's worth isn't in what he owns, but what he leaves behind. You showed me that kindness isn't weakness, and that forgiveness is harder than any fight I ever fought. If the world asks where I've gone, tell them this. I went looking for peace, and I finally found it in your mercy. You showed me what worth really means." Cole. The ink had faded from where her tears once fell. She kept the letter folded inside a small wooden box beside the hearth, next to the old gold coin that had once started it all. The town spoke of Cole Hartley like a myth now. Some said he'd gone north to start over. Others swore they'd seen him riding the ridge at sunset, keeping watch over the land he'd given away. The truth didn't matter anymore. He had become what the West loved most, a legend carved out of redemption. Mary's Kitchen became his legacy. It grew from one small room to a hall that could feed half the valley. People didn't just come for food, Abal. They came for faith, for warmth, for the reminder that decency could still win in a world that often forgot how. Children grew up hearing her name like a prayer, whispered by mothers who told them kindness had once rebuilt a broken town. One evening, as autumn painted the trees gold and scarlet, a young boy entered the kitchen with a bundle of letters. He wore a dusty hat too big for him and looked nervous as he stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "this came for you." Mary smiled. "Who's it from?" The boy shrugged. "No name, ma'am, just a drawing on the envelope." She took it and frowned. A small emblem was etched into the corner, pressed into the paper by a steady hand. A horse's head over a star. Her breath caught. She dismissed the boy gently and waited until the room was empty before opening it. Inside was a single slip of parchment. Still ridin, no signature. But she didn't need one. The handwriting, strong, sure, and familiar, made her heart ache and smile all at once. For a long moment she just stood there, staring at the horizon through the open window. The wind stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of bread, earth, and distant rain. Somewhere far beyond the hills, she imagined the sound of hooves. Steady, rhythmic, fading into the wild that had birthed him. The next morning, Mary wore her best shawl, the same one she'd wrapped around herself the night she'd met him, and walked into town. The square was alive with color. Stalls of fresh produce, children running, laughter spilling through the streets. She stopped by the new well that bore a bronze plaque reading, "Donated by M. Caldwell, in memory of the Hartley Ranch." An old preacher approached her, smiling kindly. "It's good to see you here again, Mary. Feels like the town's finally back on its feet." She nodded, her voice quiet. "It's not the land that healed this town, Reverend. It's the people who chose to share it." The preacher chuckled softly. "Maybe so, but it takes someone to light the match before the fire can spread." Mary smiled faintly, glancing at the children playing in the dust. "Then I suppose I was just the spark." As the day turned to dusk, she made her way home. The sun hung low, drenching the valley in amber light. She paused at the ridge overlooking the plain. The same view she'd watched so many times before. The same road that had brought her both ruin and redemption. The wind rose gently, carrying a sound that made her freeze. Faint, but unmistakable. The echo of a horse's whinny across the hills. She turned toward it, her breath catching, eyes searching the horizon. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw him. A lone rider in the distance, hat tilted low, coat catching the sunset. But when she blinked, he was gone. A smile touched her lips. She whispered softly, "Ride on, cowboy, the world remembers." And as the light faded from the sky, Clearwater settled into peace once more. Rebuilt not by gold or guns, but by a woman who fed a stranger, and a man who learned that mercy was worth more than money. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the billionaire cowboy rode again, never forgetting the woman who fed him when he was just a stranger. If this story touched your heart, don't let it ride off into the sunset. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing campfire of Western tales. Every week I bring you stories of courage, love, and redemption from the heart of the American frontier. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you hardest or what you would have done if you were in Mary's place. Your likes and shares help these stories reach new riders across the plains. So saddle up, stay tuned, and let's keep the spirit of the West alive, one story at a time.